Hello, welcome back. So these are some notes on the chapter The Society of Contempt from Rancière. And there's quite a bit to unpack in this chapter, and lots of questions that I have, and I'm sure you have as well. Some things I'm not quite sure what to make of, so hopefully this will be an interesting discussion, a good chance for you to collaborate, if you will, in learning this material and discussing it. So these are what I see as sort of the key themes of this chapter. Rancière, Jacotou, they really focus in on this idea of intelligence being up to an individual. That once you start putting people into groups, there's no sort of group think or hive mind, if you will. It's almost like the more people you have in the group, the dumber the group is. I'm thinking sort of like a herd mentality. You've probably heard that sort of thing, or sheeple. Seems to be kind of be what I think Rancière is getting at here. If you've heard that term, sheeple. It says social groups are incapable of reason. And I put this little picture here of the National Assembly during the French Revolution again, because this is, I think, kind of an important context to some of Rancière's thoughts. During the French Revolution, you have all these quote-unquote democratic sort of extreme equality kind of political groups forming for the revolution. Kind of like an American Revolution on steroids, or perhaps on crack, if you will. And a lot of this really went badly. I think about the terror from the French Revolution, all this sort of thing. So basically, I think the idea is Jacotou at least had sort of direct firsthand experience of what happens when, the bad things that can come from these assemblies of people, right? So I think the idea sort of follows into his definition of what he thinks about rhetoric. And this is what I really wanted us to focus in on here, because we're, rhetoricians by training, or at least aspiring to be, right? So some of this stuff seems kind of damaging to rhetoric, right? So he talks about rhetoric, uses a couple different metaphors for it. Talks about rhetoric as a perverted poetry. So you remember from the last chapter, he said something along the lines of language is kind of poetic. That's the best way to think about it. So instead of thinking about truth being communicated concretely or directly by language, instead try to think about it as the way you put poetry. It's kind of, you interpret the poetry. The poet interprets some kind of truth that he or she has come up with in the forms of these poems, and the words of the poem can, I think he used the word radiate with meanings, that some of which are intended, some of which are unintended, but it's that kind of free play, that sort of leeway that allows us to communicate and arrive at truths, right? But anyway, here he says on page 83, he's talking about rhetoric as, quote, the art of reasoning that tries to annihilate reason under the guise of reason. So pretty interesting thought there. You kind of have to spend a while, I think, thinking about that to fully grasp what he's getting at. So you could think about it kind of as a faux reason, sort of fake reasoning. I think about it as you might hear someone talking about politics, let's say, and they seem to be well versed in politics and political discussion, but then you realize that they're kind of just parroting or imitating things they've heard during a debate, sort of party lines, the talking points, and all these sorts of things. And somebody that's really good with these talking points, I mean, they can sound like they're really telling you something, right? But then you realize that there's very little substance there. It just sort of sounds reasonable. But then when you really get down to it, you realize they're not really speaking to you as an individual. They're just sort of speaking to you as a demographic, if you will, in a case study, focus group, or whatever, has determined that this is the right phrase to use, right? So I sort of think that's what Rancière is getting at here with his understanding of rhetoric. And this is not my definition of rhetoric, mind you. I'm just trying to figure out what Rancière means by the term. He also says rhetoric speaks in order to silence. And he's got the sort of example there, evocative example actually, of the eloquent speaker. So everyone wants to hear this eloquent speaker do his or her thing, right? So when they start speaking, everybody else is quiet, sort of quietly respectful, and they listen to this eloquent speaker who gets sort of to dominate the floor, right? So again, I think we sort of have an idea there of equality. I'm kind of wondering how this might also tie into his earlier discussion where he's talking about sort of artisans and their facility with a language. A language could be literally a language, also could be like the language of painting, and sort of how you had to learn this language to get good at it. So I'll stop right there and see what you think about Rancière's understanding, or perhaps in your view, misunderstanding of rhetoric and its role in politics. Okay, to move on a little bit here, we get more into his notions of sort of radical equality. Everyone is equally intelligent, and what that means to be intellectually emancipated. And it sounds, you got to be careful, I think, not to misinterpret what he's saying as advocating anarchy, because he definitely doesn't seem to be an anarchist, although some passages make him sound like that, right? But he says here on page 87, it is precisely because there is no natural reason for domination that convention, thinking about social conventions here, commands and commands absolutely. And then he follows that up with the idea that only circumstances and conventions create hierarchies of people. So in other words, if you watch a show like Downton Abbey, this one of the reasons Downton Abbey is such a sort of mesmerizing show, I think, is because people are so complacent and they're so accepting of all these rigid social hierarchies, right? I mean, get the servant class, sort of this very obvious lower class and a superior class, and there's very few characters seem to question this at all. It just seems to them to be perfectly natural. Whereas when we watch the show, we think, wow, how could those people put up with that level of inequality and so on? So Rancière wants to think to go even beyond that idea. And again, we could go back to the French Revolution and think about some of the really radical ideas coming out of that about equality. So, I guess it depends on how you feel about this. Do you think there's any kind of natural reason for domination? And if so, is there any kind of basis, anything to base that on besides just sort of social convention? It's an interesting thought, and if it, he'll say some more about this later, but it kind of makes you think that it's really not necessarily the case that things are as they are. So then he talks about truth, always a good philosophical topic, right? It's on page 90. He says, truth settles no conflict in the public place. It speaks to man only in the solitude of his conscience. It travels alone with no retinue. So I kind of thought about Rodin's statue of the thinker. You sort of think about this issue, and maybe you've got this truth. And remember, we're all sort of, I think he says, described it as describing a parabola around the truth, right? Can't quite communicate that truth. So this is an interesting thought. I spent some time trying to unpack what this means to Rancière. Obviously, the idea is you wouldn't go to this assembly, hear this great speaker, and walk away with the truth, right? Perhaps the speaker might inspire you to do your own search or inspire you to think about the topic, and you might arrive at your own truth. But remember, Rancière, we are all sort of on our own path. Everyone has a unique path that we should follow, and that nobody else can lay out that path for us. No one else can guide us along a pre-existing path, right? We have to forge our own way. So it seems something like that seems to be, to me, what Rancière is getting at here. But, of course, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Then we get into the idea of societies and government. And here's where I think Rancière stops sounding like an anarchist. It starts sounding more like, what's the word? I guess a rationalist, maybe. A realist, if you will. Because he talks about this idea of monopolies on violence. And there's other philosophers that have written on this. Carl Schmitt, for example, talks a lot about this idea that ultimately a government depends on the threat of violence, right? I mean, you hope people won't break the law, but if they choose to break the law, then the police come with their clubs and use physical force on, maybe shoot you or maybe put you in jail. But there's always that threat of legitimate violence, and the government's the only source of legitimate violence. I mean, somebody could go out and commit a criminal act, but that's a lot different than a police officer following orders, a soldier following orders, and so on and so forth. And so he says they're keeping a monopoly on legitimate violence is still the proven best way to limit violence and allow reason some asylum where it can be freely practiced. And so it seems to me here where Rancière is specifically saying, in anarchy, in a total anarchy, this wouldn't be possible, right? You'd be too worried about your neighbor breaking into your home and trying to kill you, or something like that, right? So the last thing on your mind would be learning. So it sounds like, and again, if you disagree with this interpretation, feel free, but it sounds to me like what Rancière is saying here is we kind of need this. It's a necessary evil, if you will, because if we didn't have it, we would just be in this anarchic situation and nobody would be able to be intellectually emancipated because you'd be too worried about just basic survival, right? And then he sort of says the same thing about rhetoric. He talks about how he sort of sides with Aristotle. If you remember Aristotle and his famous Art of Rhetoric or On Rhetoric book, where Aristotle at one point basically says, it'd be great if everyone was just logical and would just apply logic and reasoning to make decisions and not be swayed by emotionalism or passion. But Aristotle says at one point, but you know what? It doesn't do you much good, right, if you got the truth on your side, but you're unable to persuade anyone else, right? Because the people will respond to a certain type of rhetorical maneuvering. And it's kind of disgraceful if the person who has the truth is unable to persuade the masses, but the liar can do it very easily, right? Compares it to self-defense training. So Aristotle says it's kind of disgraceful, right? If you can't defend yourself, someone's trying to attack you. Shouldn't you know some basic, what I would say, basic martial arts, some self-defense training? Yes, you could use that self-defense training to go out and attack somebody, and that would be terrible. But then again, you could use it to protect yourself, and that sort of be sort of seems to be where Aristotle's position is. And Rancière seems to be saying something similar to Aristotle here. He talks about the if we have to have this society, if that's a necessary evil, then we need to have as many reasonable people in this society as possible. And the more reasonable people there are, the better things there'll be. He talks about the reasonable man raving. And for some reason, I thought about Carl Sagan. Sagan seems to me to be a pretty reasonable man. But if you watch his show Cosmos, he tends to get poetic. He tends to employ a lot of, pathos in his discourses, if you will. And I guess a sort of cold scientist might say, look, all that's unnecessary. You could have just presented sort of the dry facts. But obviously the dry facts are not going to appeal to everyone. They don't inspire. So anyway, he talks about the reasonable man raving. Curious to know what you think about that. And also how society could blossom under this reciprocal recognition of reasonable wills, which I thought was interesting. Again, thinking about the state of politics in America and all these talking points and all this sort of nonsense that they don't really seem to think of the viewer as someone reasonable, as an intelligent person capable of making decisions, working through this the facts of the situation, right, and arriving at an intelligent decision. They just seem to almost want to brainwash you, or just kind of repeat the same message over and over until it just kind of lulls you, right? So it seems what Rancière is saying, it doesn't have to be that way. There could be a lot more. If these politicians were viewing their audiences as people of equal intelligence, we might have a very different scenario. Okay, so that's all I got on this chapter. We could go on forever, but I'll leave it there. And hope to see you next time as we wrap up the book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. Thank you for listening.